This is the Grant Caldwell report. A partial shutdown at the Department of Homeland Security is no longer a process story in Washington. It's a live test of whether basic security functions can keep running smoothly when politics collides with paychecks. And if you rely on disaster response, or if you're watching border enforcement, this matters right now. And before we go further, subscribe so you don't miss critical updates as this develops. Because this is moving fast and the details are where the truth lives. Here's the core fact pattern. DHS funding expired Saturday, triggering a partial shutdown while lawmakers remain dug in on new restrictions and oversight rules for immigration enforcement. Congress is out until February 23, meaning the standoff can drag without anyone even in the room to vote. Now, what's confirmed versus what's still unclear. Confirmed. TSA operations continue because roughly 95% of TSA employees are deemed essential, but they're working without pay during the lapse. TSA's acting leadership has warned the longer this goes, the more pressure hits the workforce, and Senate GOP leader John Thune warned travel problems could grow, including fewer open lanes or even checkpoint closures if staffing shortages worsen. Also confirmed, immigration enforcement doesn't simply pause. Reporting says ICE and CBP operations largely continue, helped by funding from a 2025 tax and spending law that agencies can tap for deportation operations, even as Democrats push demands like limits on masks, visible ID, body cameras, and judicial warrants for entry onto private property. Now here's the part most coverage rushes past. This is not only about policy, it's about accountability when something goes wrong. The shutdown fight is tied to fallout after fatal shootings in Minneapolis involving federal officers, which has intensified calls for oversight and identification rules. And in the next 60 seconds, I'm going to walk you through exactly what's confirmed, what each side is demanding, and the one leverage point that could decide whether this ends quickly or grinds into real disruption at America's airports. Here are the verified, attributable facts as of Feb 16, 2026. No speculation, no assumptions. First, DHS entered a partial shutdown after its funding lapsed early Saturday. Most DHS functions continue because they are classified as essential, but many employees are working without pay until Congress restores funding. Second, TSA screening continues at commercial airports nationwide. DHS and TSA officials have said the majority of TSA's workforce is considered essential, meaning screening operations continue, but those employees are unpaid during the funding lapse. Reporting indicates roughly 95% of TSA's workforce remains on the job in a shutdown scenario. Third, the immediate risk to travelers is staffing strain, not an instant halt in operations. Officials have testified that missed paychecks can drive unscheduled absences. That can translate into longer wait times at checkpoints, fewer open lanes, and pressure during peak travel hours. Fourth, Congress is not in session this week. Both chambers are on break, which slows the legislative path to a resolution, even if negotiations continue behind closed doors. Fifth, the dispute centers on immigration enforcement oversight. Democrats have pushed proposals including visible identification requirements for officers, body cameras, limits on mask use, and judicial warrants for entry onto private property. Reports indicate a list of 10 reform demands was sent to Republican leadership. Sixth, White House border czar Tom Homan publicly rejected those demands as unreasonable, while stating he is not personally part of the funding negotiations. Seventh, DHS missions beyond airport screening continue, but officials have warned of degraded capacity over time. Areas like FEMA reimbursement timing, planning functions, and cyber coordination could face strain if the shutdown continues. Eighth, border enforcement operations remain active. For example, on Feb 10, CBP officers at the Laredo Port of Entry seized 16.76 pounds of cocaine, valued at approximately $6,199,798, concealed in a flour shipment. Investigations remain ongoing. Now pause there, because the real question isn't whether operations are technically running. It's how long they can run at full strength without funding. Now let's separate the claims from what can actually be verified. Democratic lawmakers argue this shutdown is about accountability. Their position, based on public reporting, is that new guardrails are necessary after fatal encounters involving federal officers. They have pushed for reforms such as visible identification, body cameras, limits on mask use, and judicial warrants before entering private property. Supporters of those proposals say transparency protects both the public and officers. That is the stated objective. Republican leadership and the White House frame the situation differently. They argue DHS funding should not be tied to policy concessions. Border Czar Tom Homan publicly dismissed the reform demands as unreasonable, and Republicans have described the shutdown as a consequence of Democrats attempting to attach operational restrictions to a funding bill. So here is the tension. One side says this is about oversight and public trust. The other says it is about political leverage and restricting immigration enforcement during an active border strategy. Now the reality check. There is no confirmed evidence that TSA screening has halted at any major airport. There is no official announcement of systemic closures. Operations are ongoing. That is fact. At the same time, there is documented precedent from prior shutdowns showing that unpaid federal workers can lead to higher absenteeism. During the 2018-2019 shutdown, TSA reported increased callouts. That historical data matters because it demonstrates what pressure can look like if pay interruptions continue. What has not been proven is whether this current lapse will produce the same effect. That remains uncertain. Another key distinction. Some media framing suggests immigration enforcement could grind to a halt. Verified reporting indicates that ICE and CBP operations continue, in part because of previously authorized funding streams. So when you hear shutdown, understand what that word does and does not mean. It does not mean airports are closed. It does not mean border enforcement has stopped. It does mean federal employees are working without pay. And that is where the political contradiction emerges. Lawmakers on both sides claim to prioritize public safety, yet the funding lapse itself introduces potential operational strain inside agencies tasked with security. The unresolved question is this: is tying reform demands to DHS funding strengthening oversight or increasing risk inside the very systems those reforms are meant to protect? That is the gap between rhetoric and reality. Now we move to the question that actually decides how this unfolds. Who made this decision? Who holds leverage? And who absorbs the consequences? Funding for DHS does not lapse on its own. Congress controls appropriations. That means lawmakers on both sides had advance notice of the deadline. They also had the authority to pass a clean funding extension while negotiations continued. That did not happen. Democrats tied funding to a package of immigration enforcement reforms. Republicans refused to accept those conditions. Leadership in both chambers knew that without agreement, DHS would enter a partial shutdown. So accountability starts there. The executive branch does not write the funding bill. It executes the law that Congress passes. But the White House has influence. Public messaging from administration officials, including Border Czar Tom Homan, has been firm in rejecting the proposed restrictions. That signals something important. There is no indication the administration is willing to concede on operational authority in order to reopen funding quickly. Now look at the power dynamic. Lawmakers pushing reforms argue that oversight is necessary precisely because DHS agencies wield significant authority that includes detention, surveillance, and use of force. They view funding as leverage. Republican leadership argues that essential security agencies should not be negotiating chips. They view reform demands as political pressure tactics during an active border enforcement period. Both sides claim they are protecting the public. But here's the structural reality. TSA agents, CBP officers, ICE personnel, FEMA planners, cyber analysts, none of them decided this standoff, yet they are the ones working without pay. That is measurable. Airports do not vote on reform packages. Travelers do not write oversight language. Yet if staffing pressure increases, the public feels it first, and that raises a deeper accountability issue. If delays escalate, each side will blame the other. If enforcement actions spark controversy, oversight advocates will point to the absence of reform. If reforms are passed under pressure, enforcement critics will argue security was weakened. This is not just a funding lapse. It is a power contest over who defines operational boundaries for federal law enforcement. And the longer it lasts, the more the pressure shifts from Washington rhetoric to real-world impact. Now let's bring this back to where it actually lands. Not in committee rooms, not in cable news segments, but in the real world. If you're flying this week, here's what matters. TSA screening is operating. That is confirmed. There is no verified nationwide shutdown of airport checkpoints, but agents are working without pay, and history shows that prolonged pay interruptions can increase absenteeism. When that happens, lanes close. When lanes close, wait times grow. That is the pressure point to watch. The first warning sign will not be an airport closure. It will be staffing gaps during peak travel hours. If this drags, you'll see longer lines before you see official alerts. Now zoom out. DHS is more than TSA. It includes border security, immigration enforcement, cyber protection, disaster coordination, and FEMA reimbursement systems. Many of those functions continue. But internal strain accumulates quietly. Delays in reimbursements, slower administrative processing, reduced planning bandwidth. Those don't make headlines immediately. They surface later. That's the hidden cost of a funding lapse. And here's the broader accountability question. Both parties say they are protecting public safety. Democrats argue reforms increase transparency and accountability. Republicans argue tying those reforms to funding creates operational instability. But here's the reality. Neither side can avoid. When funding lapses, the workforce absorbs the shock. When negotiations stall, essential employees work unpaid. When rhetoric escalates, public trust erodes. Now what happens next? Congress returns soon. Watch whether leadership moves a short-term clean extension or insists on resolving the reform fight first. Watch for absenteeism data from TSA. That will tell you whether strain is building. Watch whether either side softens its language. When tone changes, negotiations are moving. And finally, watch whether this remains a Washington fight or begins showing up in airport delays and operational slowdowns. Because once it becomes visible to travelers and voters, the political math shifts fast. Here's the bottom line. DHS is partially shut down. TSA operations continue. Border enforcement continues. The dispute centers on oversight and operational authority. Employees are unpaid. Congress is out of session. And the pressure clock is ticking. This is not panic territory, but it is a test of governance. And governance is measured by outcomes, not talking points. Subscribe for updates. We follow the facts.